somewhere in Britain right now. Maybe in a dusty attic box, maybe inside an old purse tucked behind a wardrobe, maybe even in a jar sitting quietly on someone's kitchen shelf. There lies a single penny that isn't just worth a few pence, but a fortune. A penny that has survived decades of history, outlived generations, and slipped through millions of hands without revealing its secret. Because hidden among the most ordinary coins in the UK are three truly exceptional pennies. One so rare it was never meant to circulate, one born from a minting mistake that almost shouldn't exist, and one forged in the age of Queen Victoria that has become a relic of a world long gone. These aren't just coins. They're mysteries, relics, legends. The elusive 1933 penny that collectors whisper about like a myth. The 1983 new Pence error that hides in plain sight like a shadow nobody sees. And the Victorian bronze pennies that have carried the weight of centuries and still command thousands today. And the wildest part? Any one of these could be sitting in your home right now, waiting, silent, untouched, unnoticed. So before you hand over your change at the shop, before you ignore that old jar of pennies, before you let another day pass without checking, listen closely. Because the next British penny you pick up might not just be a coin. It might be the rare piece of history collectors spend their lives chasing. A small copper treasure capable of rewriting your wallet, your curiosity, and maybe even your future. The history of the British penny of 1967 is deeply connected to the final era of the pre-decimal coinage system, a system that had remained in use in Britain for centuries and carried within it the long legacy of the old SD monetary structure. The penny of 1967 stands as one of the last mass-produced coins before the great shift to decimalization, and its story captures the end of an age when Britain was preparing to modernize its currency system after centuries of tradition. The coin itself was authorized during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, and its design followed the familiar style introduced in the early years of her reign, carrying on the artistic heritage that linked modern Britain to its earlier Victorian and Edwardian periods on the obverse. The coin presented the young laureate portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, created by Mary Gillick, a design chosen for its grace, simplicity, and classic symbolism of continuity. This portrait represented the Queen, at the beginning of her reign, conveying a sense of renewal for the nation in the post-war era, and it remained widely recognized across the Commonwealth territories that also struck coins with her likeness on the reverse of the penny, appeared the timeless image of Britannia, seated with shield and trident, a symbol that had been part of British coinage since the 17th century, embodying strength, maritime power, national identity, and an unbroken connection to ancient Roman iconography. The 1967 penny became iconic, not because it introduced something new, but because it marked the end of the long chapter that had shaped British everyday life for generations. During the mid-1960s, the British government began preparing for decimalization after decades of debate and public pressure. Modern commerce, schooling, accounting, and global trade were increasingly influenced by simple decimal-based systems, and the United Kingdom recognized that its traditional system of pounds, shillings, and pence, although historically significant, was becoming cumbersome in a world driven by technological progress. The announcement that Britain would fully decimalize by 1971 triggered one of the most intensive coin production periods in modern British minting history. The Royal Mint needed vast numbers of coins, both pre-decimal and new decimal denominations, to ensure a smooth national transition, and among the last coins to be struck in these high quantities were the pennies of 1967. Because 1967 pennies were produced in such enormous volumes, many millions entered circulation, and yet many were also stored away in bags, drawers, and collections, leading them to become among the most commonly found pre-decimal pennies. Today, their abundance, however, only adds to their historical meaning, as they represent a moment when the old system was winding down, a period when the nation was preparing to replace centuries of monetary tradition with a streamlined modern structure. The production of the 1967 penny continued partly to avoid having to mint a 1968 version, since the focus of the Royal Mint was shifting toward producing trial pieces patterns and early runs of the new decimal coins that would soon dominate British currency. Meanwhile, the familiar bronze penny continued to serve the public, as everyday purchases still relied on the old denominations, and children growing up in the 1960s still counted pocket money in pennies and halfpennies. Experiencing the final decade of a changing economic era, the alloy used for the penny remained the traditional bronze mixture of copper, tin, and zinc, giving the coin its warm reddish color, a color that became instantly recognizable to collectors, historians, and the generations who handled these coins in shops, buses, and cinemas across Britain. As Decimal Day approached, scheduled for February 1971, the penny of 1967 was already transforming from common currency into a historical keepsake, representing the last full year of penny production before the decimal era reshaped British coinage forever. Although some pennies were dated 1970, they were struck only for collectors and were never released into circulation, making the 1967 penny the final circulating workhorse of the pre-decimal system. Once decimalization arrived, the old pennies were gradually withdrawn, though many survived as souvenirs, reminders of childhood, and symbols of an older Britain that had now passed into history. The design of Britannia would later disappear from the regular issue of pennies for decades, before finally returning in a modernized form, reflecting how national symbols evolve across eras. Yet the original Britannia of the 1967 penny remains one of the most recognized and beloved motifs in British numismatic history, representing stability and continuity through centuries of change. Today, collectors value the 1967 penny not for rarity, but for the story it tells. Its presence adds a powerful narrative to collections about the end of the old monetary world and the dawn of the modern decimal age. It is a coin that speaks of post-war Britain, of cultural transition, of economic modernization, and of the everyday lives of millions who handled this bronze piece without realizing they were holding the final chapter of a centuries-old tradition in their hands. The 1967 penny stands as a reminder that historical value is not always tied to scarcity, but rather to meaning, memory, and the passage of time, and every surviving coin continues to echo the last heartbeat of an era that shaped British currency for generations. As we continue exploring the deeper history surrounding the British penny of 1967, we step further back into the long evolution of British coinage and the cultural landscape that shaped this final circulating pre-decimal penny. The story of the 1967 penny reaches far beyond a single year, for it represents the culmination of centuries of changing designs, shifting values, and national identity expressed through metal coinage. Long before Queen Elizabeth II ever appeared on a coin, the penny was a foundational piece of British money dating back to the Anglo-Saxon period, when early pennies were tiny silver pieces introduced under kings, such as Offa of Mercia. These early pennies were symbols of royal authority, minted with the monarch's name and carrying intricate designs that reflected the artistry of the early medieval age. Over the centuries, the penny changed metal size, weight, and purpose, sometimes silver, sometimes debased, sometimes replaced entirely by new denominations, yet always returning in new forms, whenever the economy demanded a low-value coin for daily transactions. By the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution transformed Britain into a global power, and with this new economic environment came the bronze penny introduced during the reign of Queen Victoria in 1860. This new bronze coin replaced the cumbersome copper pennies that had become too heavy and impractical for everyday use. The bronze penny quickly became a familiar sight across Victorian Britain, used by factory workers, shopkeepers, school children, and households from all walks of life. The iconic Britannia design on the reverse had already appeared on coins for generations, but under Queen Victoria, it became especially symbolic, representing British naval dominance, imperial strength, and national pride. This artistic tradition would later carry forward into the 20th century, eventually reaching the young portrait of Queen Elizabeth II and the 1967 penny itself. The 20th century brought dramatic social and economic changes to Britain, and the penny evolved along with them. The First World War strained the supply of metals, leading to adjustments in coin production. The story of the United Kingdom. One penny coin from the year 1965 begins during a period of transition in British currency and national identity, and the coin itself represents the final generation of the large bronze pennies that had circulated for more than a century before decimalization changed the structure of the nation's money system. The year 1965 stands near the end of the era when the old pre-decimal coins were still the daily instruments of purchase and trade, and the penny of this year therefore carries the historical weight of an entire monetary tradition. The obverse of the 1965 penny features the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, showing her in the early years of her reign. This portrait by Mary Gillick displays the Queen wearing a laurel wreath which symbolizes youth, dignity, and continuity. It is one of the most admired portraits used on British coinage because of its classical style and because it reflects the optimism of the post-war period when the United Kingdom was rebuilding and redefining its place in the world. Surrounding the portrait is the inscription that honors her title as Queen of the Realm. In 1965, the portrait had already been in use for more than a decade, but it still represented the young monarch whose image was known throughout the Commonwealth. On the reverse of the coin is the familiar figure of Britannia, a national symbol dating back centuries. Britannia is seated facing right, holding her trident and shield. Behind her is the sea symbolized by gentle horizontal lines, along with a lighthouse that has appeared on many earlier pennies as well. The word penny appears above, and the date 1965 is placed at the bottom. This design had been used on British pennies since the reign of Queen Victoria, and had become one of the most iconic images in British numismatics. Its continued use in 1965 shows how deeply the design was connected to British identity and maritime history. The material of the 1965 penny is bronze composed mostly of copper, along with tin and zinc. These pennies were heavier and larger than modern one-penny coins, and their size made them easily recognizable in the hand and in the pocket. Coins from this period often developed a deep, rich tone over time due to the copper content which gave older pennies a warm appearance. At the time, they were minted by the Royal Mint in large numbers because the penny remained an essential part of everyday trade throughout the United Kingdom. The year 1965 is significant in British monetary history because it falls within the era when decimalization was being planned. Although the decimal system would not officially begin until 1971, preparations were already underway behind the scenes. Policymakers knew that the old penny would eventually be replaced, and the mint continued to produce the bronze penny, but with the understanding that its days were numbered. This gives the 1965 penny historical value as one of the later examples of a coinage system that had existed in Britain for centuries. In circulation, the 1965 penny was used in everyday life for small purchases in shops, bakeries, markets, and public transport services. Children often handled these coins when buying sweets or toys, and adults used them regularly for basic transactions. Because of their large size, they were also used in coin-operated machines of the time. Many people who grew up during the 1950s and 1960s remember the satisfying weight of the penny and its familiar sound when dropped into a till or vending machine. Collectors today view the 1965 penny as a charming reminder of the pre-decimal past. While the coin is not rare because millions were minted, it still holds nostalgic value. Coins in uncirculated condition with their original mint luster are more desirable for numismatists. The design, the portrait, and the historical context make it an appealing piece for anyone interested in British history or the evolution of coinage. The 1965 penny also represents the end of an artistic era. The Britannia design that had graced pennies for generations would soon disappear once the new decimal system was introduced. Modern designs would take its place, and while they brought innovation and new symbolism, the departure of Britannia from the penny marked the closing of a long chapter in national iconography. For this reason, the 1965 penny is more than a simple piece of metal. It is a link to Britain's numismatic past and a testament to tradition, continuity, and change. When examining the coin closely, you can still see the craftsmanship that went into its production. The raised edges, the finely detailed Britannia figure, and the crisp portrait of the Queen show the Royal Mint's high standards. Even common circulation coins were made with careful attention to artistic balance and proportional harmony. Over time, many examples became worn smooth because they passed through countless hands during years of use. These signs of wear also tell the story of everyday life in the United Kingdom during the mid-20th century. The wider historical background of 1965 also adds to the importance of the coin. The United Kingdom was in a period of social and cultural evolution, with modern influences shaping music, fashion, and public attitudes. The British Empire was transforming into the Commonwealth, and the national economy was adjusting to global changes. Within this changing society, the penny remained a constant and familiar object, something that connected people with the long history of British currency. As the final years of the large bronze penny approached, the public gradually became aware that change was coming. Newspapers and public notices discussed decimalization, and educational materials were prepared for schools so that children would understand the new system before 1971. Although the 1965 penny continued to circulate normally, it was already part of a closing chapter in monetary history and would later become a memory for generations who had grown up using the old coins. Today, when collectors or history enthusiasts hold a 1965 penny, they may feel a sense of continuity stretching back to the Victorian era and even earlier. The coin represents the rise and evolution of Britain's economic and cultural identity. Every detail from the portrait of the Queen to the image of Britannia reflects traditions that shaped the nation. Even though the penny is no longer used in its original form, it remains an object of study, appreciation, and historical reflection. This long history makes the 1965 UK 1 penny an excellent subject for a detailed YouTube video because it allows viewers to explore not only the story of a coin, but also the story of a nation moving from one era to another. You can expand each part of this narration over 2 hours by discussing the minting process, the design origins, the role of Britannia, the era of Queen Elizabeth II, the economic background, and the transition to decimalization, giving your audience both education and nostalgia. The deeper history of the 1965 United Kingdom. 1 penny begins long before its actual year of minting, because the coin belongs to a lineage that stretches back many centuries, and its design reflects traditions developed through generations of political change, artistic evolution, and national identity. The British penny of 1921 belongs to a period of profound transition in the United Kingdom, a moment in which the country was recovering from the devastation of the First World War, while simultaneously entering a new phase of economic, political, and social reform. The coin itself may look simple at first glance, but the circumstances that shaped its creation and circulation tell a story of national struggle, industrial change, and the evolution of British money minted under the reign of King George V, who ruled from 1910 to 1936. The 1921 penny stands at the intersection of old Victorian minting traditions and the new realities of a modernizing empire. In 1921, the Royal Mint was still coping with the after-effects of wartime demands, because during the war, enormous amounts of small coinage had been produced to meet the needs of soldiers' factories and civilian rationing systems. After the war, however, the economy shifted, inflation rose, and the public held on to coins differently, creating uneven patterns of supply and circulation. The penny of this year, therefore, reflects not only the artistic style of the early 20th century, but also the economic and industrial pressures that influenced how many were struck and how they entered daily life. The obverse of the 1921 penny features the portrait of King George V, designed by Sir Bertram McKennell. This portrait became one of the most recognizable royal effigies in British numismatic history, showing the king in a left-facing profile with a dignified expression intended to project stability. During a turbulent age, George V had guided Britain through the First World War and was now presiding over a period of Reconstruction trade weakness and rising labor unrest. The portrait on the penny symbolized continuity, reassurance, and national identity at a time when the empire was beginning to experience new political challenges, including independence movements in Ireland, India, and other regions of the world. The reverse side maintains the iconic image of Britannia, a symbol used on British coinage for centuries. Britannia appears seated, wearing a flowing classical gown, holding a trident in her left hand and a shield beside her adorned with the Union flag. The depiction represents British naval strength, stability, and imperial reach. But by 1921, this symbolism had developed new meaning. The British Empire was still vast, but the war had weakened its economic structure and challenged its global dominance. The presence of Britannia on the penny served as a reminder of the empire's resilience, but also reflected nostalgia for a period when naval power had been uncontested and industrial prosperity seemed unshakable. The metal composition of the 1921 penny remains bronze containing copper with small proportions of tin and zinc. The quality of metal used in coins of this period often varied due to the changing availability of raw materials after the war. Since copper supplies had been heavily consumed for ammunition and wartime equipment, the Royal Mint adapted its sourcing and manufacturing processes to keep coinage production stable. The strike quality of pennies during the early 1920s can sometimes reflect these fluctuations, with examples showing differences in color, strike depth, and wear characteristics, depending on how long they remained in circulation and which minting batch they belonged to. The economic environment of Britain in 1921 exerted a visible influence on the coin's history. The year saw recession, high unemployment, and the aftermath of the coal miners' strike, which deeply affected industrial output. The use of small denomination coinage like the penny was essential in everyday transactions because wages purchases and savings habits relied heavily on coins rather than paper banknotes for small amounts. The penny served as a crucial tool in working class communities where small sums mattered greatly for food transport and household necessities. During these years, British citizens were adjusting to rising prices and fluctuating wages, meaning the penny held significant practical value. Another important aspect of the 1921 penny is its place in the evolution of British minting techniques. The Royal Mint was gradually modernizing its equipment, experimenting with improved press machinery, and refining metal preparation processes. These advancements aimed to produce coins with clearer features, longer circulation life, and lower defect rates. While earlier Victorian and Edwardian pennies sometimes showed inconsistent quality, the George V pennies from the early 1920s demonstrate a shift toward greater minting precision. The Royal Mint was also exploring designs and metal compositions that would eventually lead to major reforms in British coinage later in the century, including the shift toward decimalization. Collectors today view the 1921 penny as a key date in the series, not because it is extremely rare, but because it marks a return to steadier post-war minting after the disruptions of the 1910s. Many examples survive in circulated condition, showing the heavy wear typical of coins that passed through millions of hands during decades of economic activity. High-grade specimens, however, are highly sought after because the bronze surfaces of pennies from this era are prone to spotting toning, and marks that make well-preserved examples difficult to find. The condition of surviving coins reflects how extensively pennies were used in markets, factories, public transport systems, and everyday commerce across Britain and the Empire. In understanding the full historical significance of the 1921 penny, one must look beyond numismatics to the broader British landscape of the time. Britain was navigating renewed debates about trade unions, foreign policy, economic stability, and imperial responsibility. The Irish War of Independence was concluding, leading to the partition of Ireland in the same year. The nation was redefining its identity and adjusting to the social consequences of wartime loss, including changes in class structure, shifts in labor demographics, and evolving public expectations for political leadership. The penny was a silent witness to these changes moving through the hands of workers, soldiers, housewives, merchants, and children functioning. As a symbol of the country's shared economic life, the coin also reflects the cultural environment of post-war Britain. Entertainment industry growth, urban development, and public infrastructure improvements all involved transactions in which the penny played an active role. Penny fairs, penny newspapers, and penny tram fares were common parts of everyday life. The penny shop culture of the early 20th century represented an economic system where even the smallest unit of money carried weight and could affect family budgets. Penny savings banks encouraged disciplined saving among working-class communities, teaching financial responsibility and helping families build small reserves for emergencies. The legacy of the British penny of 1921 endures because it represents more than a monetary object. It is a compact artifact of Britain's transition from Victorian industrial might to 20th century modernity, symbolizing stability in monarchy tradition. In design and endurance in material, the 1921 penny continues to fascinate historians, collectors, and enthusiasts. As one examines the worn surfaces or the sharp details of a well-preserved specimen, they encounter the story of a nation rebuilding itself, adjusting to new global realities and confronting the challenges that shaped the rest of the century. The coin stands as a tangible reminder of the people who used it and the society that shaped it, preserving in its metal the echoes of British life in a defining historical moment.